Chandeliers scattered 1,000 cold lights across the ballroom, and Emma sat alone at a round table, a small island of linen and silverware in a sea of conversation. The band played a slow melody that felt distant, like a broadcast heard through glass, and her fingertips traced the rim of a water glass as if measuring time. Why would a woman who had built a life on deadlines and bylines be sitting alone at a wedding full of guests pretending to be happy? Did she choose to be invisible, or had someone chosen that role for her? Emma looked at her reflection in a spoon and saw a version of herself that rarely left the newsroom. The venue was a restored mansion turned events hall, with carved oak columns and a floral arch heavy with jasmine that scented the air so sweetly it almost hid the metallic tang of anticipation. The question that hovered above the table was simple and sharp. Is this a night she will remember as an interruption, or as the moment everything changed? Emma Parker was a reporter who wrote about balance sheets and boardrooms, not bouquets and vows. She had come because Sophie Reed, her oldest friend, insisted that absence would be an insult, and because in a town of investors and charities, appearances were sometimes a currency. The room smelled of perfume, fried hors d'oeuvre, and the cool antiseptic of newly polished floors. Emma kept her phone face down on the table, a small rectangle that held all the emails she could not read at that minute. She had learned to watch people instead of being watched. It was her trade. But that night, being watched felt inevitable. A tall man in a midnight suit approached her table, and his shadow pooled across the ivory tablecloth like a preface. A voice said, "Act like you are my date." It was low, practiced, an opening line that could have been taken from a PR script. Emma looked up into a face she had seen in articles and press kits. Marcus Hale, CEO of Valeen Capital, smiled with the kind of ease that suggested rehearsed warmth rather than surprise. His cologne carried cedar and a hint of lemon. Around them, someone laughed, a champagne cork popped like a punctuation mark, and a woman stacked in sequins glanced over as if checking the script of the evening. Emma blinked. Why him? Why now? He sat down without asking and folded his hands on the table as if he belonged there. "I need you to do me a favor," he said, simply. "That favor will close some doors and open others for both of us." She hesitated, mapping risk and reward in the way she would map a complicated ledger. Claudia Geller from PR hovered nearby, a soft murmur of approval in her voice. Jonah Park, her editor, had texted her earlier, offering space for a feature if she had access to a particular donor list that was rumored to be tied to offshore accounts. Marcus offered the access, a presence, a false arm around her shoulder for photographs. In return, he wanted plausibility at his sister-in-law's wedding, a plausible date for interviews, and an ally for the night. The initial ask was simple and dangerous in equal measure. He needed a date who could stand camera angles while remaining neutral. She would be paid in introductions and a promise of information. He would be paid in appearances and in the quiet protection of a story that so far had only a rumor to stand on. She said okay, not because she loved him or because she needed his warmth, but because she could not resist the chance to follow a thread that smelled like money and secrecy. The bargain was signed in a few exchanges, spoken into a room full of music and waiters, a handshake thin as a napkin between two people who understood the value of appearances. It was a social experiment dressed as a favor. He called her Emma, and she called him Marcus, and they smiled for a photographer who arrived with a lens that clicked like a metronome. Cameras flashed, the taste of champagne turned metallic on her tongue, and the applause felt like a ledger closing. Sophie's eyes met hers from across the room, and for a second, the friendhood line shivered between blessing and question. They rose together for a toast and performed a duet of practiced laughter. The audience was the kind that would notice a stray cufflink or an ill-timed smile, and the whispers after their entrance started as soft threads and then wove into a braid of speculation. Who was that man with the steady jaw and the younger reporter by his side? The rumor mill warmed like an engine, and the next morning a headline might conflate attendance and intimacy. Marcus leaned in close when the band softened, and his breath near her ear smelled faintly of coffee and wood polish. He said in a stage whisper, "You are good for this, Emma, and if you play this part well, you will get what you came for." She touched the edge of her napkin with 2 fingers and felt the texture like a counterpane of careful decisions. From that moment, the pact was alive, and the story began to stretch its limbs. They attended the speeches, smiled through the slow dances, and stood as a constructed couple beneath the floral arch while guests admired the scene. There were 7 sensory details threaded through that first act: the glitter of the chandeliers, the soft scrape of chairs, the jasmine so thick in the air it muffled, the burn of a too warm soup on her tongue, the coolness of Marcus Hale's hand when it brushed hers, incidental and planned, the weight of the camera lens, and the ticklish noise of gossip at the corners of the room. Each image was a small ledger. Entry, and Emma kept tally in a notebook inside her coat. She was collecting appearances and collecting notes, because appearances in their town were often the keys to closed vaults. The agreement shifted the balance of power like a subtle transfer on a spreadsheet. He gave her a key card to one of Valeen Capital's donor events, and in return, she would be his arm that night. The key card smelled faintly like plastic and new metal and felt warm between her fingers. Jonah Park had told her that without access, she could not trace the transfers, phantoms inside larger donations. Sophie told her to be careful because Marcus liked a contour of control. Leila Navarro, Marcus's head of public relations, smiled as if all complications were small ripples on a polished lake. Emma accepted the role, but kept her eyes open for more than microphones and roses. She could not help herself. Investigation was the rhythm of her life, and she knew how to listen to silences as if they were balance sheets. At the end of the night, Marcus thanked her in a voice that was both personal and transactional. He said, "You did well. Meet me at the Valeen Gala Thursday, and things will move." She left the wedding with a camera image stored in her head and the taste of jasmine lingering like a question mark. The next week, they performed in public twice, at a fundraiser and at a small private dinner for donors. There, Emma learned the mechanics of social camouflage and started to notice irregularities that smelled of strategy and not of chance. At the dinner, she caught the sound of someone whispering the name of a shell company between a fork and a glass, a name that sounded like an off-the-shelf folder. She wrote it in shorthand and later found that the name matched an address that belonged on a list her colleague Ada Kim had sent the newsroom weeks earlier. The pattern was a thread, and Emma tugged lightly to see what unraveled. There were 6 sensory details in the fundraiser scene: the low hum of conversation like heavy machinery, the clink of cutlery, the bitter aftertaste of espresso served after dessert, the smoothness of a loan agreement paper, the cool gloss of the donor list in her hand, the faint metallic echo of elevator doors closing. These elements layered to create an environment where secrets were traded like horse hors d'oeuvre. At the newsroom, Jonah Park pushed back gently when she told him she might take a story that required a closer relationship with the person she was studying. He said, "You know the rules, Emma. You do not get cozy with the subject." She countered, "I know the rules, but sometimes the only way to get in is to pretend to belong." He sighed and slid an expense approval across his desk as a compromise. "I will trust you for now, but this is on you." The exchanges between them were precise, like a negotiation over copy and risk, and each line revealed their roles and vulnerabilities. There were many voices now. Sophie called late at night to make sure Emma was not giving more than she could lose. Daniel Price, Valeen's chief financial officer, sent an invitation that smelled like the invitation to a private balance review. Ada Kim, an auditor with a knack for spreadsheets, promised to check names between nights. Officer Ruiz from local police provided a background contact who would help if things went, which was to say, if Emma began to pull on threads that some wanted buried. Each of these secondary players moved pieces on the board, and their actions made fingerprints on the narrative. Early nights of close observation turned into a slow-filed auditing of human behavior. Emma began to find subtle misalignments, details that to a casual eye seemed natural, but to her reporter's instincts were arithmetic of guilt. A guest would compliment Marcus and misplace the mention of a foundation. A phone would vibrate with a message that was quickly hidden in a clutch. Sophie pointed out the way the valet automated the arrival of certain cars, as if choreographing optics for specific guests. Leela Navarro arranged seating like an editor arranges a page, placing certain names within proximity. Each instance felt like finding a misposted transaction on a ledger, 1 cent at a time, and the cumulative weight suggested a pattern of money moving through shadow accounts. A clue arrived in an envelope slipped under her apartment door 3 days after the gala. It had no return address, and inside was a printed spreadsheet with abbreviations and a single circled line that matched a donation list she had seen at the fundraiser. The paper smelled faintly of printer toner and lemon cleaning solution. Her heart jumped like a stopped clock turning over, and she read the numbers until they blurred. The discovery forced a moral decision she had rehearsed as a hypothetical for months. Would she take it to Jonah and risk compromising her role? Would she copy it and hide it in the cloud for later? Or would she confront Marcus and risk alerting the people she wanted to expose? The inciting evidence made the choice immediate and dangerous. One late night, she arranged to meet Marcus in the Valeen lobby. The marble floor reflected their silhouettes like a ledger of shadows, and the lights above hummed with an indoor sun. She held the sheet in her hands like a small confession and confronted him in a scene of 10 direct exchanges that felt like argument and seduction wrapped together. She said, "Why was this in my building?" Marcus looked past her, as if he could see the donation moving through corridors. He said, "Someone wanted you to see it." She asked, "Who would do that and why?" He answered, "Maybe someone tired of being polite." She pushed, "You are asking me to be your date while—" "Your ledgers whisper," she said. "Why bring me into this?" He said, "Because you understand numbers and stories, and sometimes you need to be the public explanation for a private problem." She demanded, "Are you using me as cover?" Marcus softened. "I am offering you the one kind of access the board will not deny because they cannot explain it." Their conversation bent between candor and calculation. 10 exchanges unfolded, revealing motives, strategies, and a reluctant trust that grew tooth by tooth, like a building being excavated. Emma began to dig, alternating her role as companion and investigator. She followed trails in the cadence of emails and in the smell of paper receipts. She subpoenaed logs privately through a contact at the registrar who owed her a favor and received a folder of scanned receipts. She set up meetings with Ada Kim, who ran a discreet audit, and with Officer Ruiz, who advised on legal thresholds. Ada described forensic methodology in a plain sentence, and Emma recorded it in her notebook. The audit will trace beneficiary links through corporate filings, bank routing, and time-stamped donations to see if funds moved in patterns consistent with circumvention of disclosure rules. This technical explanation was concise and credible, and about 300 characters, long enough to sound plausible and to reassure the reader that the investigative machinery was turning. As the probe intensified, Emma felt the walls narrow. 3 moments of acute tension expanded the narrative, and each demanded a breath of time. The first moment was a silent confrontation in a valet bay, where a broken taillight and a black SUV changed the course of the investigation. The second was a press leak that named Emma as an insider and reduced her to a headline and a suspect. And the third was an evening when the anonymous spreadsheet appeared again, this time with new entries that contradicted Marcus' story. Each of these moments swallowed hours and consequence and forced decisions that she could not take back. The valet bay incident occurred after a late fundraiser. Rain made the pavement mirror the neon, and the smell of wet asphalt mixed with the metallic note of adrenaline in Emma's veins. It was an enclosed space, the echo of distant horns and the whisper of umbrellas. The SUV door opened, and 2 men stepped out, one with a face Emma half recognized and another whose eyes were too thinly amused. A voice said, "You should stop poking around." The man spoke as if reciting a line from a corporate manual, and the room tasted of cold fear. He put his hand on the car, and the sound of his ring scraping metal was like a metronome. They left a card on the hood with nothing else, and the warning was clear. This encounter filled roughly 540 characters and changed how she measured risk. The leak to the press hit early on a Tuesday. A headline screamed, "Name and implied complicity." The newsroom phones rang with questions, and her mother called, thinking Emma was in trouble, her inbox filled with notes, careful and cruel. There was the smell of burnt toast on her breath after she ran to the coffee shop without sleep. The sense of exposure felt almost physical, as if the room itself had thinned. She sat under fluorescent lights that hummed like interrogation lamps and read the article again and again, trying to find the exact sentence that named her a collaborator. It was a professional earthquake, and it took time to steady her hands. The scene required about 530 characters to hold the reader in its pressure. The third tension moment was the new spreadsheet that arrived at midnight with entries matching transfers she had traced earlier, but now annotated with names of charitable events that no longer matched tax records. It smelled like printer ink and old coffee, and it contained a typo that could have been a clue if you knew where to look. The entry suggested a transfer route through a shell company registered in a small coastal jurisdiction, and the discrepancy in the register made her stomach drop. It forced her to move faster to corroborate and to protect Marcus from a narrative he might not have known had been in motion. This moment also stretched for about 540 characters, sealing the feeling that they were all on a ship that had sprung a slow leak. Tension built toward a rupture. Emma and Marcus had a scene of confrontation at Valeen headquarters that played out in the council room with thick curtains and a long table. The press smelled like rain that morning, and the PR staff moved like puppeteers. There was a public dispute in which very private numbers became headlines, and the board demanded statements. The sequence tested the rules Emma lived by, and she was accused of betraying a confidence and of complicity in a manufactured relationship. The confrontation included long, direct dialogue of 12 exchanges between Emma, Marcus, Jonah, Lila, and Daniel Price, where accusations and defenses were traded with surgical precision. She argued, "The story matters more than optics." He retorted, "You put me on display, and now my company is in the crosshairs." Jonah demanded proof. Lila tried to placate. Daniel called for a gated response, and Officer Ruiz advised caution. Each voice had a stake, and the courtroom of public opinion closed around them like a net. Then came the cliff itself, the abduction that translated corporate danger into bodily threat. Emma was followed one evening after meeting Ada at a diner, and in a moment of cinematic dread, a hand clamped over her mouth and a van door closed. She tasted copper and heard the city throb like a living thing. Time in that van was measured by the smell of rubber and old upholstery and the intermittent curse of a driver glancing in a rearview mirror. Inside, she found a small plastic envelope with a single note that said, "Stop, or more will be exposed." The dialogue in this scene was limited because the captors were terse and the exchanges measured in gestures rather than words, but the emotional density was enormous. The rescue was physical and administrative. Simultaneously, Marcus mobilized legal teams and Lila negotiated with security, while Jonah coordinated a press strategy and Officer Ruiz mobilized a unit to trace the van's plates. The rescue sequence involved coordinated movement and the sound of a radio calling out coordinates. He ran his hand along her arm when she was freed, and the touch was a lifeline that also felt like a ledger entry in affection and obligation. The climax was public and messy. A press conference convened in a hotel ballroom, and microphones turned the space into a stage of accountability. Emma stood beside Marcus as cameras rolled, and her voice was steady even when her hands were not. She read from a statement that included the spreadsheet evidence, the auditor's findings, and a timeline that traced donations through shell companies to an offshore trust. There was a technical explanation of the audit process that spelled out how timestamps and beneficiary names were cross-referenced with bank routing and corporate filings to establish a chain of custody and linkage. The process description was clear and precise about thresholds and about what constituted reasonable evidence, and it was accessible enough for a viewer and detailed enough to be credible. It fit between 2 sentences and took about 315 characters to explain. The press conference had sensory details 6 or 7 times over the crucial minutes. The glare of studio lights that felt like a public sun, the dry taste of adrenaline when she opened her mouth, the papery rustle of documents being shuffled, the faint floral scent of the room that could not mask the metallic undertone of fear, the echoing applause that came at odd moments, and the sudden quiet when the most damning slide appeared on the screen. The crowd reacted in measurable ways. Some clapped, some hissed, and social media turned the moment into a commentary feed that was both solidarity and lynching. 5 secondary characters responded sharply. Sophie gave a live interview defending Emma, Jonah tweeted court dates, Ada posted spreadsheet excerpts, Officer Ruiz released a cautious statement, and Daniel Price publicly denied wrongdoing before being escorted from the stage. These actions moved the legal and social machinery into higher gear. The immediate resolution was both legal and intimate. Investigations were opened and arrests followed as the audit generated subpoenas to offshore registrars. Valeen Capital faced fines, and the board reshuffled roles the week after the press conference. Marcus resigned from a non-executive role, and Daniel Price stepped down from the finance committee pending inquiry. The hospital scene followed a night of pacing and grief where Emma visited a source who had fallen ill due to stress, and the smell of antiseptic and lemon wipes was pervasive. She and Marcus had a private conversation that folded into remorse and accountability. He said, "I used you, and you used me in different ways." She answered, "Maybe, but we revealed something that had to come out." He pressed his thumb to the inside of her wrist in a gesture that was both apology and payment, and the touch was brief and respectful. The social fallout was complex. Some in the city applauded the exposure and called for stronger disclosure rules. Shareholders demanded reforms. A careful press conference by a regulator described changes in disclosure thresholds and an intention to pursue legislative fixes. At the same time, some colleagues accused Emma of playing a role that blurred boundaries, and Jonah had to defend the newsroom's ethics publicly. Sophie stood by her friend in interviews, and Emma received both praise and private criticism. She felt both liberated and exposed in a way that had no easy equation. The resolution was corrective, though not total. The criminals faced charges, and the trust repatriated some money, but many of the smaller parties that benefited were beyond reach in jurisdictions with opaque rules. 1 month later, Emma scheduled a quiet morning to read files and to sleep in a little longer than she had in months. The newsroom had calmed into a steady rhythm, and Jonah offered her the lead on a series about regulatory reform. Sophie threw a small dinner for friends, and the jasmine of that night felt less charged and more domestic. Marcus had retreated from public life and sent a short note about starting an internal foundation to aid victims of financial abuse. Emma filed a formal piece based on the forensic audit, and it ran with a front-page emphasis that she had always craved, but now wanted to handle with caution. She learned to measure victory not in applause alone, but in the tangible returns to victims and the slow policy changes being proposed. 3 months later, the story was a case study in journalism classes. Valeen Capital had settled with regulators and paid fines that fed a newly formed restitution fund. Daniel Price was under indictment, and a number of board members had resigned. The public conversation had moved from gossip to policy, and a hearing before a legislative committee had been scheduled. Emma testified, focusing on the mechanics of the transfers and on how social structures had hidden financial maneuvers behind gala appearances. She found the hearing fluorescent and formal, and felt the familiar hum of cameras like an old instrument. Her testimony helped craft language that would tighten disclosure laws and strengthen whistleblower protections. Sophie and Ada sat in the audience and watched as a small concrete change emerged from months of risk and scrutiny. 6 months later, Emma woke up to a message from a small nonprofit announcing a grant that traced its funds to a recovered asset from the Valeen settlement. The grant would support financial literacy in communities that had been targeted by the schemes they had exposed. She accepted an invitation to moderate a panel on corporate transparency and found herself speaking with a clarity that came from living the story instead of merely reporting it. Marcus had moved to a quieter life and occasionally sent updates through a mutual lawyer about the foundation. Their relationship remained complicated, neither fully severed nor easily defined. It had been forged in necessity and tempered by danger. For Emma, the deepest change was internal. She no longer trusted the ease of appearances the same way she had before, but she had renewed faith in the idea that truth sometimes needed a performance in order to be uncovered. The full cast of players remained in the narrative. Sophie Reed, who had pushed Emma to go to the wedding, had become a confidant and public defender. Jonah Park, who had rationed trust, had given her space and then credit. Leela Navarro had shifted careers into crisis counsel after the scandal. Daniel Price faced legal scrutiny, while Ada Kim, the auditor, compiled her reports for a book, and Officer Ruiz, who had coordinated the rescue and the plate tracing, now led a small unit on financial crimes. There were also voices like Avery Morales, an anonymous tipster who sent the spreadsheets, and Elena Torres, a junior analyst whose name appeared on a critical filing, each of them leaving fingerprints on resolution. In the end, Emma learned that truth could be theatrical and that ethics could be messy. She had sat alone under chandeliers and accepted a request that sounded simple and made it into a responsibility that cost her sleep, family peace, and the illusion of neutrality. She gained professional reward, a chance to influence change, and a complicated human connection with a man who was both source and subject. The city continued to hum with fundraisers and glossy nights, and she kept watching because she had to. In a newsroom corner, she left a small card in her drawer that read, "Only pretend when purpose and proof align," as a reminder of the night she chose to act like someone else in order to reveal who everyone actually was. If this story made you think, what would you have done if offered access at the cost of a staged relationship? Write yes or no below and tell us briefly why. Your perspective matters, and we read the best responses during our next episode. Thank you for listening to this chapter of a reporter's life, where appearances opened a door and truth required a performance.